In the winter of 1992, Daniel Harper, his wife Rebecca, and their 10-year-old son, Ethan, moved into an old farmhouse on the edge of Millfield, Pennsylvania. The house sat alone at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by miles of empty farmland. It had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. Most residents in Millfield knew the property well. They passed it on the highway every day, but almost no one ever drove up to it. Some people claimed strange lights had been seen inside the house at night. Others said they heard footsteps on the porch even when the property was empty. When the Harper family bought the farmhouse, a few neighbors tried to warn them. Rebecca told friends she didn't believe in ghost stories. Daniel said the house was simply old and misunderstood. For 19 days, the family settled into their new life. Then, and on the morning of October 18th, something changed. Daniel Harper called the local sheriff's office. His voice was shaking. He told the dispatcher someone had been walking through their house all night. But when deputies arrived at the farmhouse 20 minutes later, the Harpers were gone. The front door was open. Every light in the house was turned on, and what investigators later discovered inside that farmhouse would become one of the most unsettling cases ever reported in Millfield County. The town of Millfield, Pennsylvania, is the kind of place most people pass without noticing. With a population of just under 3,000 residents, Millfield sits quietly between miles of farmland, narrow country roads, and dense woods that stretch for miles in every direction. From above, the town looks small and isolated. A few grocery stores, a gas station near the highway, a church that has stood on Main Street for more than 100 years. Most families in Millfield have lived there for generations. Grandparents, parents, and children often grow up in the same houses their relatives once lived in. It is the kind of community where people know their neighbors, where everyone recognizes the same last names, and where unfamiliar faces rarely go unnoticed. Just outside the town limits, past several long stretches of farmland, sits a narrow gravel road called Hawthorne Road. The road leads through a quiet area surrounded by tall trees and open fields. At the very end of that road stands a 2-story farmhouse, white paint peeling from its wooden walls, a large front porch facing the empty fields, and windows that had been dark for nearly 20 years. For most residents of Millfield, the house was simply known as the Hawthorne Farmhouse. Many people in town avoided driving near it. Some said the house carried a strange feeling. Others said it was just an old building that had been neglected for too long. But the stories about the property had existed long before Daniel Harper and his family ever arrived. According to local records, the house was built in 1948 by a farmer named Arthur Bell. Arthur lived there with his wife Margaret Bell for many years. Their farm once stretched across several acres of land surrounding the house. But in the early 1970s, the Bells suddenly left the property. Neighbors later said they packed their belongings quickly and moved out of town without much explanation. The farmhouse remained empty after that. Year after year, the building slowly deteriorated. Grass grew tall around the property. The wooden fence surrounding the yard collapsed in several places, and the windows remained dark. Over time, the house developed a reputation among the people living nearby. Some residents claimed they occasionally saw lights inside the farmhouse late at night. Others said they heard sounds coming from the porch or the upper floor when no one had lived there for years. Most people eventually stopped talking about it. In small towns like Millfield, stories often fade with time, but a few residents never forgot what they had experienced near the property. One of them was Thomas Green, a farmer who owned land about half a mile from the farmhouse. Green had lived in Millfield his entire life. In 1984, while checking on his cattle late one evening, he passed the Hawthorne farmhouse while driving along the gravel road. The house was still empty at that time, but as he drove past the property, he noticed something unusual. A faint yellow light was shining from one of the upstairs windows. Green slowed his truck and looked toward the house. At first, he assumed someone must have broken into the property, but as he continued watching the window, he noticed something that unsettled him. He said the light inside the room appeared to move, almost as if someone were walking back and forth behind the window. Green later told a few people in town what he had seen. Some believed him. Others assumed he had simply mistaken reflections from passing cars or distant farm equipment. Still, he never forgot that moment. Another resident, Linda Watkins, remembered hearing something even stranger several years later. In 1989, Watkins was driving home from her job at a diner outside town. It was close to midnight. As she turned onto Hawthorne Road, she slowed down near the abandoned farmhouse. She said she heard voices. At first, she believed a group of teenagers might have been exploring the property, but when she stopped her car and looked toward the house, the entire building was dark. No lights, no movement, just silence surrounding the empty farmhouse. Watkins drove away quickly and never returned to that road at night again. Stories like these were shared quietly among longtime residents. They were rarely discussed openly. Most people simply avoided the property altogether. So when the farmhouse was finally sold in the summer of 1992, the news spread quickly through Millfield. And the new owners were a family from outside the area, Daniel Harper, his wife, Rebecca, and their 10-year-old son, Ethan. To the Harpers, the farmhouse looked like an opportunity. The land was large, the price was surprisingly low, and Daniel believed the property simply needed repairs and patience. When they arrived in Millfield and began moving their belongings into the house, several neighbors watched from a distance. Some of them quietly wondered how long the family would stay there. Others hoped the strange stories surrounding the property had always been nothing more than rumors. For the first few weeks, the Harper family appeared to settle in without any problems. Daniel worked on repairing the porch and replacing broken window frames. Rebecca organized the interior rooms and cleaned years of dust from the floors and walls. Ethan began exploring the surrounding woods and fields. From the outside, everything seemed peaceful, but several people living nearby later said something about the house had changed after the Harpers moved in. At night, lights could sometimes be seen through the upstairs windows, and occasionally, neighbors driving past the property said they thought they heard sounds coming from inside the house, sounds that did not always resemble normal voices. When Daniel Harper first saw the farmhouse on Hawthorne Road, he believed he had found the perfect place to start over. Daniel was 38 years old. He had spent most of his life working construction in nearby cities, restoring older buildings that most people had given up on. He enjoyed repairing things that had been neglected for years, and the Hawthorne farmhouse looked exactly like that kind of project. To Daniel, the peeling paint and broken fence were not warning signs. They were possibilities. He told his wife that with enough work, the house could become a beautiful home again. Rebecca Harper, however, had a different first impression. Rebecca was 35 and far more sensitive to her surroundings than Daniel. When she first stepped inside the farmhouse, she immediately noticed how quiet the house felt. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of silence that seems to press against the walls. Still, Rebecca trusted her husband's judgment. The house was affordable, the land was wide and open, and the small town of Millfield seemed like a safe place to raise their child. Their son, Ethan Harper, did not share the same excitement. Ethan was 10 years old when the family moved to Millfield. Back in their previous town, he had friends, a school he enjoyed, and a neighborhood he understood. Moving to a quiet farmhouse surrounded by empty fields felt like a punishment. The first night they slept in the house, Ethan told his parents he missed their old home. Rebecca tried to comfort him. She explained that the move was meant to give their family a quieter life, more space, more freedom. Daniel promised Ethan that once the house was repaired, it would feel like an adventure. A place where Ethan could explore the woods, ride his bike for miles, and build tree houses if he wanted. But Ethan remained unsure. During the first few days, he spent most of his time walking around the property, slowly becoming familiar with the land. The farmhouse itself had many rooms, and a large living area downstairs, a kitchen facing the back fields, and 3 bedrooms on the second floor connected by a narrow hallway. Ethan chose the bedroom at the end of the hall. The room had a single window facing the woods behind the house. Inside the room was an old wooden closet built into the wall. The closet door was heavy, made from thick wood panels that creaked slightly whenever it opened. At first, Ethan didn't pay much attention to it. The house was old. Small noises and creaks were expected. Meanwhile, Daniel began working on repairs almost immediately. Every morning, he walked around the property with a notebook, listing everything that needed to be fixed. Loose porch boards, broken shingles, cracked window frames. Daniel spent hours outside restoring sections of the house piece by piece. Rebecca focused on the inside. She cleaned the floors, repainted several rooms, and tried to remove years of dust from the furniture left behind by previous owners. Despite the house's condition, life slowly began settling into a routine. But there was one person in the area who watched the Harper family with quiet concern. His name was William Collins. Most people in Millfield simply called him Mr. Collins. Collins was a retired farmer in his late 70s who lived about a quarter mile from the Hawthorne farmhouse. He had spent nearly his entire life working land near that property. From his porch, he could see the long gravel road that led to the Harper home. One afternoon, Daniel noticed the elderly man standing near the roadside fence watching him repair the front porch. Daniel walked over and introduced himself. Collins shook his hand politely, and he welcomed the Harper family to Millfield and asked how they were adjusting to the house. Daniel told him everything was going well. He explained his plans to restore the farmhouse completely. Collins listened quietly. For a moment, he simply looked toward the house. Then he said something Daniel didn't quite understand at the time. Collins told him the house had been empty for a very long time, and sometimes, places that sit empty for too many years can feel different when people return to them. Daniel assumed the old man was referring to the house's condition. He assured Collins that once the repairs were finished, the place would look completely different. Collins nodded slowly, but before leaving, he gave Daniel one final piece of advice. He told him that if anything strange ever happened inside the house, he shouldn't ignore it. Daniel laughed lightly and thanked him for the concern. To him, the warning sounded like one of the small-town rumors he had already heard about the farmhouse. That evening, Ethan was upstairs unpacking some of his things. Most of his toys were still in boxes near the wall. While organizing his room, he opened the wooden closet to hang a few jackets. As the closet door swung open, Ethan noticed something unusual on the inside surface of the wood. There were several long marks carved into the door, thin scratches running vertically from the middle of the panel down toward the bottom. At first, Ethan thought it might just be damage from old furniture or tools. But when he ran his fingers across the wood, he realized the marks were deeper than normal scratches, almost like something had dragged sharply across the door over and over again. Ethan looked closer. There were dozens of them, some older, some that looked slightly newer. He called out to his mother from the hallway and showed her the marks. Rebecca examined the door carefully. She assumed they were simply old damage left by previous owners. Maybe a pet scratching the wood. Maybe tools hitting the door during repairs years earlier. She told Ethan not to worry about it. The house had been standing for decades. Marks like that could come from anything. But as Ethan closed the closet door later that night, he couldn't stop thinking about something. All of the scratches were on the inside of the closet door, as if something had been trying to get out. The first few weeks inside the Hawthorne farmhouse passed quietly. At least, that is how Daniel Harper described it later. The house was old, and old houses often made strange sounds. Wood expands and contracts. Pipes shift. Floors settle after years of neglect. Daniel had worked in construction long enough to know that unfamiliar buildings often feel strange during the first weeks of living inside them. But for Rebecca Harper and Ethan Harper, the house began to feel unusual much sooner. It started with small things that were easy to ignore, things that seemed harmless if you didn't think about them for too long. One evening, about 2 weeks after the Harpers moved into the farmhouse, Ethan was lying in bed reading. His bedroom sat at the end of the second-floor hallway. Outside his window, the woods behind the house were dark and quiet. Rebecca had already gone downstairs to finish washing dishes, while Daniel remained outside finishing repairs on the porch light. At around 9 o'clock, Ethan heard something above him. At first, it sounded like a slow step, then another. A soft, dull creaking sound moved across the ceiling of his bedroom. Ethan sat up in bed and listened carefully. Another step, then another. The sound moved slowly from one side of the ceiling to the other, as if someone was walking directly above his room. Ethan waited for a moment before calling out, "Dad?" There was no response. He climbed out of bed and stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet. Rebecca was still downstairs in the kitchen. Daniel was outside. And there was something else Ethan suddenly remembered. There was no floor above his room. The second floor was the highest level of the farmhouse. Above the bedrooms was only the roof. Ethan stood there for a moment staring at the ceiling. The footsteps had stopped. After a few seconds, he returned to his room and convinced himself it must have been something else. Maybe a branch hitting the roof. Maybe an animal walking across the shingles. He didn't mention it that night. But the next day, something similar happened to Rebecca. Late in the afternoon, she stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes. Sunlight filtered through the window above the counter, lighting the room softly. The farmhouse was quiet, except for the sound of running water and the occasional creak of old floorboards. Daniel had driven into town to buy supplies for repairs. Ethan was outside near the barn, tossing a baseball against the wooden wall. Rebecca finished rinsing a plate and placed it into the drying rack. As she reached for another dish, she heard something behind her. At first, it sounded like someone speaking very softly. Rebecca paused and turned off the faucet. The voice disappeared. She stood still, listening. The house was silent. Rebecca shook her head and continued washing the dishes. A few seconds later, she heard it again. This time it was clearer, a faint whisper, low, almost impossible to understand. It sounded like it came from somewhere behind her near the dining area. Rebecca turned quickly. No one was there. The kitchen chairs were neatly pushed under the table. The hallway leading toward the living room was empty. Rebecca walked slowly through the first floor, checking each room. The living room was empty. The front hallway was quiet. The porch door was closed. When she stepped outside, she saw Ethan throwing the baseball against the barn wall. He hadn't come inside. Rebecca didn't mention what she had heard. Instead, she convinced herself it had simply been the sound of wind passing through the old structure of the house. But 2 nights later, something happened that the entire family noticed. It was 2:17 in the morning. Daniel later remembered the exact time because he had looked directly at the clock beside the bed. He had woken up suddenly. At first, he didn't know why. The bedroom was dark. Rebecca was asleep beside him. The entire house felt still. Then he heard something from downstairs, a scraping sound, slow and heavy. Daniel sat up slightly in bed and listened. The sound came again, a long wooden drag across the kitchen floor. Rebecca woke up as well. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. They both sat quietly for a moment. The sound came a third time. It was unmistakable now. Something downstairs was moving. Daniel climbed out of bed and walked toward the hallway. Rebecca followed behind him. They moved carefully down the staircase, trying not to make noise. The kitchen light was off, but faint moonlight came through the window above the sink. Daniel stepped into the room first. Rebecca stood just behind him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. One of the kitchen chairs had moved. Earlier that night, all 4 chairs had been pushed neatly against the dining table. But now, one of them sat several feet away from the table in the center of the kitchen floor. It was angled slightly toward the hallway, as if someone had just stood up from it. Then Daniel walked slowly into the room. He placed his hand on the chair and looked around. Every door in the house was closed. The windows were locked. There was no one inside the farmhouse except their family. Rebecca stood silently near the doorway. "Maybe the floor shifted," Daniel said finally. "The wood in these old houses moves sometimes." Rebecca didn't respond. Daniel pushed the chair back under the table. He checked the back door and the windows. Everything was secure. After a few minutes, they returned upstairs. Neither of them spoke much about it afterward. Daniel believed it had been caused by uneven flooring. Perhaps the chair had slowly slid across the surface during the night. Rebecca suggested the wind might have moved it somehow. Even Ethan, when they mentioned it the next morning, shrugged it off. "When old houses make strange noises, things move sometimes." That was the explanation the family chose to believe. But after that night, Rebecca began waking up almost every morning at the same exact time, 2:17 a.m. After the night, the kitchen chair moved across the floor. Life inside the Hawthorne farmhouse tried to return to normal, at least on the surface. Daniel Harper continued repairing the house during the day. Loose boards were replaced on the porch. Several cracked windows were removed and fitted with new frames. He worked long hours, often telling Rebecca that once the farmhouse was fully restored, the strange feelings everyone talked about would disappear. Old buildings, he explained, always settle and shift after people begin living inside them again. To Daniel, everything still had a reasonable explanation. But for Rebecca Harper, and the nights inside the house were beginning to feel different. A pattern had started to form. Almost every night, Rebecca woke up at exactly 2:17 a.m. At first, she believed it was coincidence. But after it happened 5 nights in a row, she began noticing something else. Each time she woke up, the house was completely silent. Too silent. Not even the usual creaks of wood or distant sounds from the wind outside, just a stillness that seemed to sit inside the walls. One night, about a month after moving into the farmhouse, Rebecca woke up again at the same time. The digital clock beside the bed read 2:17. Daniel was asleep next to her. Rebecca turned slightly and looked toward the bedroom doorway. At first, she thought she was still half asleep. Someone was standing in the hallway, a dark shape, tall and motionless. Rebecca froze, but her heart began beating faster as her eyes tried to adjust to the darkness. The figure stood just beyond the doorway, partially hidden by the hallway shadows. For a moment, Rebecca thought it might be Ethan. Maybe he had woken up during the night. Maybe he was standing there waiting for them. "Ethan," she whispered. The figure didn't move. Rebecca slowly reached toward the lamp on the bedside table. Her hand trembled slightly as she switched it on. The light filled the room instantly. The hallway was empty. No one stood in the doorway. Rebecca sat upright in bed, staring at the hall. Daniel stirred beside her. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly. Rebecca hesitated before answering. "I thought someone was standing there." Daniel looked toward the doorway. "Ethan probably went back to bed." Rebecca wasn't convinced. And she stood up and walked down the hallway toward Ethan's room. The door was closed. When she opened it, Ethan was asleep under his blanket. The room was quiet. Rebecca looked around slowly. Nothing appeared unusual. But when she returned to the bedroom, the uneasy feeling stayed with her. Over the next few days, the farmhouse began producing new sounds. At first, they came from inside the walls, scratching, faint, irregular scraping noises that echoed through the hallways late at night. The sounds often came from different parts of the house, sometimes behind the living room wall, sometimes near the staircase, sometimes directly beside Ethan's bedroom. Daniel believed it was animals. He told Rebecca that old farmhouses often had raccoons or squirrels living inside the walls. And he even inspected the exterior siding looking for openings where animals might enter. But he didn't find anything. And the sounds continued. One evening, while Rebecca prepared dinner in the kitchen, another strange event occurred. She had just placed a pot on the stove when she heard a loud wooden knock behind her. Rebecca turned around. One of the kitchen cabinets had swung open. She frowned slightly and walked over to close it. A few minutes later, while cutting vegetables at the counter, she heard the same sound again. Another cabinet door had opened. Rebecca closed it as well. But moments later, two more cabinet doors slowly creaked open at the same time. Rebecca stood in the middle of the kitchen staring at them. There was no wind inside the house. The windows were closed. The hinges didn't appear broken. Still, she shut them again and tried to ignore it. When Daniel returned home later that evening, she mentioned the cabinets. Daniel inspected them carefully. "The hinges are old," he said after a moment. "They probably loosened over time." He tightened several screws and tested the doors. They remained closed. For Daniel, the explanation was simple. But later that same night, Rebecca woke up again at 2:17 a.m. And when she walked downstairs the next morning, every single cabinet in the kitchen was open. Daniel stared at them for several seconds. Then he closed each one without speaking. It was the first time Rebecca noticed something different in his expression. He didn't laugh the way he normally did. He didn't offer an immediate explanation. He simply stood there quietly. Over the next few days, the strange incidents continued. Ethan mentioned hearing scratching sounds again inside his bedroom walls. Sometimes they sounded like something slowly dragging along the wood. Other times, it resembled faint tapping. Rebecca occasionally heard the same whispering sound she had noticed weeks earlier while standing near the sink. Daniel tried to remain practical, but eventually, even he began to feel uneasy about the growing number of strange events. One afternoon, after returning from town, Daniel brought home a small security camera. It was the type normally used for monitoring building entrances. Rebecca watched as he unpacked it at the kitchen table. "You think someone's getting inside the house?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "I just want to see what's happening at night." He installed the camera in the second-floor hallway, pointing directly toward the bedrooms, and the small device sat just above the hallway shelf facing Ethan's door and the staircase. Daniel connected it to a monitor placed on the nightstand beside their bed. "If anything moves up here," he said, "we'll see it." Rebecca nodded slowly. That night, the farmhouse became quiet again. The Harpers went to bed around 11. For several hours, nothing happened. But sometime after midnight, the hallway camera began recording. That night, the farmhouse was unusually quiet. Outside, the wind had completely died down. The fields around Hawthorne Road were still, and the woods behind the house stood motionless in the darkness. Inside the Harper home, the only light came from the small digital monitor sitting on the nightstand beside Daniel Harper's bed. And the screen displayed the live feed from the security camera mounted in the second-floor hallway. The image was grainy and black and white. It showed the narrow hallway, the staircase leading down to the first floor, and two bedroom doors facing each other across the hall. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The camera recorded the empty hallway. The doors remained closed. Every now and then, the old house creaked softly as the wood shifted. Around 1:40 a.m., Daniel woke briefly and glanced at the monitor. Everything looked normal. He rolled over and went back to sleep. But at 2:16 a.m., the camera captured something unusual. At first, it was barely noticeable. A faint shadow appeared near the far end of the hallway. The movement was slow, almost blending with the darkness around the staircase. For several seconds, the hallway remained empty. Then the shadow moved again. It stretched across the wall beside Ethan Harper's bedroom door. The camera didn't show anyone entering the hallway. No door had opened. Yet the shadow drifted slowly across the floor, as if something invisible had passed in front of the camera. A moment later, Ethan's bedroom door shifted slightly. The knob turned just enough for the door to open a few inches. The hallway remained silent. The door continued opening slowly on its own. Inside the room, the darkness looked deeper than the hallway outside. For nearly 20 seconds, the door stayed open. Then, without warning, it closed again. Slowly, the knob turned back into place. At 2:17 a.m., something else appeared near the staircase. A shape. The camera struggled to focus as the figure moved. It was not completely solid, and the outline looked blurred, almost distorted, like a human form standing near the top of the stairs. The figure seemed tall, its head slightly tilted toward the hallway. For several seconds, the shape remained there. Then it moved. Not walking, not stepping. Just drifting slightly across the frame. The camera recorded the shape turning toward Ethan's door. Then, suddenly, the image flickered. Static briefly filled the screen. When the video cleared again, the hallway was empty. No shadow, no figure, no movement. The recording continued for the rest of the night. Nothing else happened. The next morning, Daniel woke earlier than usual. While Rebecca prepared breakfast downstairs, he checked the monitor and scrolled through the recorded footage. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual, but when he reached the 2:16 a.m. mark, he leaned closer to the screen. The shadow, the door opening, the shape near the staircase. Daniel replayed the footage 3 times. Each time, the same movements appeared. When Rebecca Harper came upstairs a few minutes later, Daniel didn't say anything at first. He simply turned the monitor toward her. "Watch this," he said quietly. Rebecca stood beside the bed while the video played. The shadow crossed the hallway. Ethan's door slowly opened. Then came the moment near the staircase. Rebecca covered her mouth slightly. "What is that?" she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. He rewound the footage again. The image still looked distorted. The figure had no clear face, no clear features, but the shape resembled a person standing at the top of the stairs. Daniel tried explaining it. Maybe it was a lighting glitch. Maybe the camera had misread a shadow. Maybe a reflection from a passing car outside had caused the distortion. But deep down, he wasn't convinced by his own explanations. Rebecca suggested something else. What if someone was inside the house? Daniel immediately shook his head. And every door had been locked. The windows were secure. There was no sign that anyone had entered. Still, the footage left both of them unsettled. But what happened later that same day made the situation even more disturbing. That afternoon, Rebecca noticed something unusual on her phone. She had placed the phone on the nightstand the previous night before going to sleep. When she picked it up, she saw an audio recording saved in her voice recorder app. Rebecca frowned. She didn't remember recording anything. Curious, she pressed play. At first, the recording sounded like normal background noise, the faint hum of the house, soft breathing. The sound likely came from the bedroom during the night. Rebecca assumed she might have accidentally activated the recorder in her sleep, but after about 15 seconds, something changed. A whisper appeared in the recording. It was extremely quiet. Rebecca increased the volume and played the clip again. The whisper became clearer. It sounded like a voice speaking softly near the phone, a voice that did not belong to Daniel or Ethan. Rebecca felt a chill move down her arms as she listened closely. The voice spoke only one sentence, slow, low, barely audible. "She shouldn't be here." Rebecca replayed the recording 3 more times. The words were unmistakable. "She shouldn't be here." When Daniel came back inside from working on the porch, Rebecca handed him the phone without saying anything. He listened carefully, then listened again. Daniel looked toward the staircase for a moment before speaking. "Did you record this?" he asked. Rebecca shook her head. "No." The two of them stood quietly in the kitchen, and neither knew what to say next. Upstairs, the hallway camera continued recording the empty second floor. And for the first time since moving into the farmhouse, the Harpers began to wonder if the house was trying to tell them something. The footage from the hallway camera and the strange voice recording stayed on Daniel Harper's mind for the rest of the week. He tried not to show how much it bothered him. During the day, he continued working around the farmhouse as if everything was normal. He repaired loose siding, replaced broken boards near the back steps, and cleared weeds from the old fence line. But at night, he kept checking the hallway monitor beside the bed. Nothing unusual appeared again. Still, the uneasy feeling inside the house didn't go away. Several days later, another small detail caught Daniel's attention. While walking through the kitchen one afternoon, he noticed a narrow wooden door near the back hallway. The door was built low into the wall, almost hidden behind a tall pantry cabinet. Daniel remembered seeing it during the first week in the house, but he had never tried opening it. Now, standing in front of it, he noticed something strange. The door had been sealed shut. Several old boards had been nailed across it from the outside. The wood looked aged, as if it had been closed off many years earlier. Rebecca stepped into the kitchen as Daniel examined the door. "What's that?" she asked. Daniel pointed at the boards. "Looks like it used to lead somewhere." He grabbed a flashlight from the counter and leaned closer. The hinges were still visible behind the boards, and a faint draft of cool air slipped through a thin crack between the door and the frame. "Maybe a storage space," Daniel said quietly. Rebecca looked uneasy. "You think it's the basement?" Daniel shrugged. He hadn't seen any other entrance leading underground. Most farmhouses built during the 1940s had basements used for storage or storm shelters. But the Harper family had never found one inside the house. Now it seemed possible the entrance had simply been sealed. That evening, Daniel returned with a hammer and pry bar. Rebecca stood nearby while he carefully removed the old boards one by one. The wood cracked easily. Dust filled the air as the final plank came loose. After the boards were removed, Daniel placed his hand on the small door handle and pulled. For a moment, it resisted. Then the door creaked open slowly. A narrow set of wooden stairs descended into darkness. Cold air drifted up from below. Rebecca stepped back slightly. "Daniel, maybe we shouldn't go down there right now." Daniel shined the flashlight into the opening. The beam revealed rough concrete walls and a dirt floor far below. "It's just a basement," he said. Still, something about the space felt different. The air smelled old, not just dusty, but stale, like a room that had been sealed for decades. Daniel stepped onto the first stair. The wood creaked loudly beneath his weight. Rebecca hesitated before following behind him. Each step echoed through the narrow space as they descended. When Daniel reached the bottom, he swung the flashlight across the basement floor. The room was larger than expected. Old furniture sat scattered along the walls, a broken wooden table, two rusted farming tools leaning against a support beam, several crates filled with dusty glass jars. Cobwebs stretched across nearly every corner of the room. It looked exactly like a place that had been abandoned long ago. Daniel slowly walked across the floor, examining the items. Most of the furniture appeared to date back decades. The wood was cracked and discolored. Several metal tools had rusted almost completely through. Rebecca stood near the stairs, looking around nervously. "How long do you think this has been closed?" she asked. Daniel ran his hand along the concrete wall. "A long time." As he continued searching the basement, something else caught his attention. Near the far corner of the room, a section of the wall looked slightly different. The concrete surface there was uneven. Yeah, almost like it had been altered at some point. Daniel moved closer and brushed away dust with his sleeve. Behind the dust, he noticed a thin wooden panel embedded within the wall. It didn't match the surrounding concrete. Rebecca walked over and stared at it. That doesn't look original. Daniel pressed gently against the panel. It shifted slightly. He looked around the basement floor and picked up a small crowbar lying beside one of the old crates. Carefully, he slid the metal edge between the panel and the wall. With a short pull, the wood popped loose. The panel swung open slowly. Behind it was a narrow hidden space built into the wall. Inside sat a small wooden box. The box looked old. Its surface was covered in dust, and the metal latch had darkened with age. Daniel lifted it out carefully and placed it on the basement floor. Rebecca knelt beside him. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel opened the latch. Inside the box were several folded newspaper clippings. Beneath them were a stack of black and white photographs. The photographs immediately drew Rebecca's attention. They showed groups of children standing together outside what appeared to be the same farmhouse. The pictures looked old. Most were faded around the edges. The children were dressed in clothing typical of the early 1960s. Rebecca slowly flipped through them. Several photos showed the same young girl. She appeared around 8 or 9 years old. Long dark hair, a simple dress. In one picture, she stood near the front porch of the farmhouse. In another, she smiled beside a wooden swing hanging from a tree. Rebecca turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink on the back were 2 words: "A Margaret Carter." Daniel unfolded one of the newspaper clippings. The headline read, "Local Girl Missing. Search Continues." The article was dated August 1964. Daniel read the paragraph slowly. It described the disappearance of a young girl who had vanished from the Hawthorne farmhouse. Her name appeared several times in the article. Margaret Carter. According to the report, Margaret had been 9 years old. She lived in the farmhouse with her parents. One evening, she disappeared from her bedroom. The house had been searched thoroughly. Neighbors joined local police in looking across the surrounding farmland and woods. But Margaret Carter was never found. Daniel continued reading. The investigation lasted several weeks before the search was eventually called off. Authorities never determined what happened inside the house that night. Yet Rebecca sat silently beside him. The basement felt colder now. She looked again at the photographs of the smiling girl standing near the farmhouse porch. Then she remembered the voice recorded on her phone, the whisper that had spoken during the night. She shouldn't be here. Rebecca slowly looked toward the staircase leading back upstairs, and for the first time since discovering the basement, a disturbing thought entered her mind. What if someone in that house had never truly left? After the discovery in the basement, the atmosphere inside the Hawthorne farmhouse began to change. Before that day, the strange events had been unsettling but subtle. A chair moving, cabinet doors opening, a shadow crossing the hallway camera. But after Daniel Harper and Rebecca Harper found the box hidden behind the basement wall, the activity inside the house became impossible to ignore. It started the very next night. Around 2:17 a.m., Daniel woke up suddenly. This time it wasn't silence that woke him. It was the sound of heavy footsteps. The noise came from the hallway upstairs. Slow, deliberate. A footstep, then another, moving across the floorboards outside their bedroom door. Daniel sat upright immediately. Rebecca woke seconds later when she heard the same thing. Both of them stared at the bedroom door. The footsteps continued. One step, then another, back and forth along the hallway. Daniel reached for the monitor connected to the hallway camera. The screen flickered with the familiar black and white image. The hallway was empty. No one was visible. Yet the footsteps continued moving across the floor outside. Rebecca whispered, "Daniel, someone's walking up there." Daniel stared at the screen. Nothing appeared on the camera. but the sound continued clearly through the house. Then suddenly, the footsteps stopped directly outside Ethan Harper's bedroom door. Daniel stood up quickly. He opened the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The house was completely quiet again. Ethan's door was closed. Daniel walked down the hall and pushed it open gently. Ethan was asleep in bed. Nothing appeared unusual, but Daniel could not explain what he and Rebecca had just heard, and that was only the beginning. Over the next few nights, the house seemed to grow louder. The old floorboards began creaking more frequently. The doors that had always stayed closed suddenly started slamming shut on their own. One evening, Rebecca was folding laundry in the living room when the door to the upstairs hallway slammed violently. The sound echoed through the entire house. Rebecca rushed to the staircase and looked up. The hallway was empty, but the air felt strangely cold. Daniel inspected the hinges later that night. They were secure. No windows were open. There was no wind strong enough to move the door like that. Still, Daniel insisted the house was simply settling. But something far more disturbing happened a few days later. One morning, Ethan Harper came downstairs looking tired and quiet. Rebecca noticed him rubbing his arm while sitting at the kitchen table. "What's wrong?" she asked. Ethan hesitated before answering. "See, my arm hurts." Rebecca gently pulled back the sleeve of his shirt. 3 thin scratches ran across Ethan's forearm. They were fresh, red, and slightly swollen. Rebecca frowned. "Did you fall or scrape it on something?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "I woke up like that." Rebecca examined the marks carefully. They looked almost like fingernail scratches, 3 lines running parallel across the skin. Daniel walked into the kitchen a moment later. Rebecca showed him Ethan's arm. Daniel studied the marks for a few seconds. "Maybe you scratched yourself in your sleep," he suggested. Ethan shook his head again. "I didn't." Rebecca noticed something else then. Ethan looked frightened. "Did something happen last night?" she asked. The boy stared at the kitchen floor before answering. "I thought someone was in my room." Rebecca felt a chill run through her body. "What do you mean?" Ethan swallowed before speaking. "I woke up in the middle of the night, and I thought I saw someone standing near the closet." Daniel immediately looked toward Rebecca. "Probably a shadow," he said, but Ethan shook his head again. "It wasn't a shadow." Rebecca leaned closer. "What did it look like?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know. It was just a person standing there." The conversation ended quickly after that. Daniel didn't want Ethan thinking too much about it. He reminded him that old houses often create strange shadows at night. But Rebecca noticed that Ethan began keeping the light in his bedroom on longer each evening. The next incident happened 2 nights later. Rebecca woke up around midnight feeling thirsty. She quietly left the bedroom and walked downstairs toward the kitchen. The house was dark. Only faint moonlight entered through the windows. Rebecca reached the bottom of the staircase and walked toward the sink. As she poured herself a glass of water, something in the corner of the room caught her attention. At the far end of the kitchen, near the doorway leading to the dining area, someone was standing there. Rebecca froze. The figure was motionless, a tall, pale shape standing in the shadows. For a moment, Rebecca assumed it must be Daniel, but Daniel was upstairs, and the figure looked wrong. The body appeared thin and rigid. The face was extremely pale. The woman's hair hung loosely around her shoulders. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The figure stood silently at the edge of the kitchen floor, watching her. Rebecca blinked instinctively, and in that instant, the figure vanished. The space near the doorway was empty. Rebecca stood frozen for several seconds. Her heart pounded in her chest. Slowly, she turned on the kitchen light. The room was completely empty. Every chair sat neatly around the table. The hallway was clear. No one was inside the room. Rebecca stood there for several minutes trying to calm her breathing. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, she finally told Daniel what she had seen. Daniel listened carefully, but even he struggled to explain it. The farmhouse had already shown them shadows, moving doors, strange voices. But now Rebecca had seen something far more disturbing. A figure, a woman, standing inside their kitchen, and somewhere inside the house. Something continued walking the halls every night at 2:17 a.m. By the time October arrived, the Harper family had stopped pretending the house was normal. Too many things had happened. Too many nights had been interrupted by footsteps, slamming doors, and strange sounds moving through the walls. Even Daniel Harper, who had spent weeks explaining everything with logic, no longer felt comfortable walking through the house in the dark. The hallway camera remained installed above the second-floor shelf. Daniel had also placed 2 additional cameras downstairs, one in the living room and another near the kitchen doorway. At first, the recordings rarely captured anything unusual, but after the discovery in the basement, the cameras began triggering motion alerts more frequently. And most of the clips showed nothing more than brief shadows or small lighting changes. Still, Daniel kept saving the footage. He wanted proof of what was happening inside the house. Then came the night that changed everything. It was October 18th, 1992. The house had been quiet all evening. Rebecca had gone to bed around 11. Daniel stayed up slightly later, reviewing some of the camera recordings on the monitor beside the bed. Ethan had already fallen asleep in his room down the hallway. At 2:57 a.m., the farmhouse sat in complete darkness. The security cameras recorded their usual still images of empty rooms. But 1 second later, something unusual happened. Every camera in the house activated at the same time. The motion sensors triggered simultaneously. Daniel didn't notice at first. He was asleep. But the system immediately began recording. On the hallway camera, the image flickered slightly. The empty hallway appeared exactly as it always did. The staircase, Ethan's bedroom door, the faint outline of the living room stairs below. Then a shadow appeared near the top of the staircase. At first it looked similar to the earlier shadow the camera had captured weeks before, but this time the shape was clearer. The figure slowly rose into view from the staircase landing. It looked tall, much taller than a normal person standing in the hallway. The camera struggled to focus as the figure moved forward. Its shape remained dark and distorted, like a human outline made entirely from shadow. The figure began walking slowly down the hallway, one step, then another. The movement looked unnatural. The legs didn't move clearly. Instead, and the shape seemed to glide forward slightly between each step. The camera timestamp read 2:58 a.m. Downstairs, the living room camera also recorded movement. A dark shape briefly crossed the far side of the room, then disappeared. Upstairs, the hallway figure continued moving forward. The shadow stopped directly outside Ethan Harper's bedroom door. For several seconds, it stood there motionless. Then the door slowly opened. At that exact moment, Ethan screamed. The sound echoed through the entire house. Daniel woke instantly. Rebecca jumped upright beside him. "Ethan!" Daniel shouted. Daniel grabbed the flashlight beside the bed and rushed into the hallway. Ethan's bedroom door was already open. The boy's terrified screams continued inside the room. Daniel ran across the hallway and pushed the door wide open. Ethan was sitting upright in bed. His face was pale. His hands clutched the blanket tightly against his chest. "Dad!" he cried. Daniel rushed to the bedside. Rebecca arrived seconds later. "What happened?" Daniel asked quickly. Ethan pointed toward the corner of the room near the closet. "There was someone here." Daniel turned immediately. The room was empty. The closet door was closed. No one stood anywhere inside the room. Rebecca knelt beside the bed. "Ethan, what did you see?" The boy's breathing was shaky. "He was standing right there," Ethan said, pointing again beside the bed. Daniel looked at the floor carefully. There was nothing there. "Who was standing there?" Rebecca asked softly. Ethan hesitated. Then he said something that made both of them freeze. "He was whispering." Daniel frowned. "What did he say?" Ethan looked confused, almost frightened by his own memory. He kept whispering a name. Rebecca leaned closer. "What name?" Ethan swallowed slowly. "Margaret." The room fell silent. Daniel and Rebecca looked at each other immediately. They had never told Ethan about the newspaper clippings in the basement. They had never mentioned Margaret Carter. But Ethan continued speaking. "He kept saying it over and over," the boy whispered. "Margaret. Margaret. Margaret." Daniel felt a cold sensation move down his spine. Rebecca held Ethan tightly. The boy's eyes slowly moved toward the hallway door. Then he whispered something else. "He said she's still here." After the night Ethan screamed, the Harper family barely slept. Daniel Harper stayed awake until morning, sitting in a chair in the hallway with the flashlight beside him and the camera monitor resting on his lap. Every small sound inside the farmhouse now felt threatening. The floor creaked, the walls shifted. Even the wind outside brushing against the old siding sounded different. But the hallway camera recorded nothing else that night. Still, something had clearly happened inside Ethan's room, and Ethan had said something Daniel could not ignore. The boy had spoken the name Margaret, the same name Daniel and Rebecca had discovered in the basement only days earlier. The same name printed across the newspaper clipping from 1964. Neither parent had ever mentioned that story in front of Ethan. Yet somehow, in the middle of the night, Ethan had heard someone whispering that name beside his bed. For the first time since moving to the farmhouse, Daniel finally admitted something to Rebecca the next morning. "We shouldn't stay here much longer." Rebecca didn't argue. She had already reached the same conclusion. For weeks, she had tried convincing herself the house was simply old and unfamiliar, but the events had grown worse. Footsteps, scratches, shadows. Now Ethan was hearing voices. The decision was quiet but final. They would leave the farmhouse. But moving a family out of a house isn't something that happens instantly. Daniel needed time to arrange transportation and storage. He told Rebecca they would leave within a few days. Unfortunately, the farmhouse seemed to sense their decision, because the activity inside the house became worse than it had ever been. The final night inside the house arrived 2 days later. Most of their belongings were already packed into boxes. Daniel planned to load the remaining items into the truck early the next morning. Rebecca put Ethan to bed around 10 o'clock. The boy seemed relieved when she told him they were leaving soon. For the first time in weeks, Ethan actually smiled. By midnight, the house had grown completely quiet again. Rebecca and Daniel were lying awake in bed, both staring toward the dark hallway. Neither of them felt comfortable sleeping. At 2:41 a.m., the first sound came from below. A loud bang echoed from somewhere underneath the house. Rebecca sat upright instantly. What was that? Daniel listened carefully. Another bang followed. This time it was louder. The sound clearly came from the basement. Daniel grabbed the flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The basement door at the end of the kitchen hallway was closed, but something below it was moving. Then the banging started again, heavy strikes against the basement walls. Rebecca clutched the stair railing as the noise continued. It sounded like someone was pounding from inside the basement. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door. The banging grew faster, louder, more violent. Then suddenly, the house lights flickered, once, twice. The kitchen light flashed rapidly before dimming again. The living room lamp flickered in quick bursts. Rebecca turned toward Daniel. "Daniel, we need to go, now." Another loud crash shook the basement door. The banging now sounded desperate, almost frantic. Daniel didn't hesitate anymore. He rushed upstairs. "Ethan!" he shouted. Within seconds, Ethan ran into the hallway carrying his small backpack. The lights flickered again, and the hallway camera monitor beside Daniel suddenly switched on by itself. Static filled the screen. Then the image returned. The hallway camera was recording again, but the Harpers didn't notice. They were too busy grabbing the last bags and coats. As Daniel rushed toward the front door, something happened that made all three of them freeze. A voice whispered through the hallway. Not faint, not distant, clear, close. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the staircase, from the hallway itself. The whisper said only two words. "Don't leave." Rebecca grabbed Ethan immediately. Daniel opened the front door without looking back. They ran outside into the cold night air. The sky was still dark. The fields surrounding the farmhouse were silent. And Daniel threw the bags into the truck while Rebecca helped Ethan into the back seat. As the engine started, Daniel glanced once toward the house. For a moment, he thought he saw something moving inside the upstairs window, a shadow passing across the glass. But he didn't wait to confirm it. The truck pulled away from the property. The Harper family drove down the gravel road without stopping. They left the farmhouse behind before sunrise, and none of them ever returned. The Hawthorne farmhouse stood empty again after the Harper family left. Daniel and Rebecca never publicly explained why they moved so suddenly. To most people in Millfield, the story was simple. A family had bought an old farmhouse and decided the renovation was too much work. But a few residents noticed how quickly the Harpers disappeared. Within a week, and the house was completely vacant. Months later, the property was purchased by another family from outside the area. According to local records, the new owners only stayed in the house for 3 nights. Then they left. The house was placed back on the market almost immediately. After that, no one lived there again for several years. But strange reports continued to come from people living near Hawthorne Road. One farmer claimed he occasionally saw lights turning on inside the farmhouse late at night. Another neighbor reported hearing faint sounds near the property while driving past after midnight. And then there were the sightings. Several residents claimed they had seen a young girl standing at the upstairs window. She appeared late at night, watching the road, watching the empty fields, watching anyone who passed by the house. But there was one detail about those sightings that disturbed locals the most. The Hawthorne farmhouse only had one full story. The upper level contained bedrooms, but there was no window facing the road from a second floor. Yet the girl people described was always standing far above the ground, looking down from a place that should not exist. And according to the old newspaper clipping from 1964, the missing child who disappeared from that house was named Margaret Carter. Her body was never found, and some people in Millfield believe she may have never left the farmhouse at all. Today, the old farmhouse still stands at the far end of Hawthorne Road, just outside the quiet town of Millfield, Pennsylvania. The paint has faded even more over the years. The wooden fence that once surrounded the yard has almost completely collapsed, and tall grass now covers most of the property, slowly reclaiming the land around the empty building. Most residents in Millfield know the house well, but very few people are willing to drive past it after dark. A few residents claim they can still hear a young girl whispering from somewhere inside the house. So now the question remains: do you think the Harper family experienced a real haunting inside that farmhouse? Or was something far darker hiding within those walls the entire time? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy chilling true-style horror stories like this one, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that might keep you awake tonight.